This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Coveil. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Ryan Holiday. This is Ryan's, I don't know how many times Ryan has appeared. No, he's appeared a handful of times. One of my favorite guests. Always brings fantastic insights. Today we're discussing his new book, Ego is the Enemy. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Ryan Holiday. First, let me say, I have to blame you for my Orson Welles addiction today. Going through YouTube, I specifically caught a clip, an 11-minute clip from 1960, him being interviewed by the BBC and asking him if he thought his success with Citizen Kane at such a young age was a bad thing. And I having gone through your newest work, I'm like, wow, spot on question. And his answer was really great. His answer was like, look, these opportunities don't come along. You can't force it. And, it came along early in my life. I'm thankful for it. I wish they came all the time. And Orson Welles is a character, but he was pretty humble about the answer. I thought it dovetailed perfectly into where you're going with your work right now.
I was really fascinated by him too, because I'd always heard that he was very embittered by what had happened to him, that he made this amazing movie and it wasn't appreciated in its own time, and that he'd been so viciously attacked by the powers that be for making it, specifically the one power of William Randolph Hearst. But when I really read about it, and then I was reading about the eulogy that his girlfriend gave him when he died, that there really was none of that bitterness. In fact, he sort of took it all in stride as this sort of larger than life character who just sort of saw it all as part of this journey. I found to be very fascinating and very inspiring, because I'm not sure I would have necessarily had the same reaction.
It would have been tough. I mean, I've had moments in my life where so-called powerful people came at me, and it does knock you off your step at first, and you don't like it, especially if it's not fair, perhaps is what many might argue in the Hearst against Wells case. Yeah. Or to make this when you pour yourself into a creative project, anyone that stands between you and that project reaching the audience that you think it deserves, that's where you get, because you're so possessive of your work and protective of what went into it, that's where the bitterness and anger and hatred comes in so easily. One, I guess I would ask, and I think this is what Hearst did, it's asking what that accomplishes in terms of actually helping you reach that audience. And two, these are things that in some ways you don't control. And so if someone comes in and attempts to attack you or screw you over or hurt you, are you going to let them ruin your personal happiness on top of that? And I think that's what Hearst managed well enough, and I found to be inspiring. Martin Luther King says this, right? He says, hate is too great a burden to bear, but often that's a burden that many of us bear willingly, and we carry around for us in some cases for many, many yeyears. And it gets back to, I think, the foundation of all your work so far, which is the Stoicism, as we might call the angry Buddhist. But yeah, I think having that foundation, and I know you aspire to have that foundation, I highly empathize and really seek to be there too. Because if you can just kind of let it go, that's so much of it. And as the Stoicism is like, look, imagine the worst case possibility. And once you imagine it fully, how can it hurt you?
Yeah, and to go to the Hearst example, if as a creator you take pride in the fact that you made something amazing, not how well that thing does financially or critically, then you're in a much better position, because these people can't hurt you the same way that someone whose judgment is suspended until the box office receipts come in is inherently much more vulnerable. So that's something I've tried to take with my own work, is that if I'm happy with the work that I've done and the book that I've created, not completely so, but if that's where the bulk of my my judgment of what success is or isn't is in the product itself, I'm in a much more invulnerable and strong position, because then I'm, as the Stoics would say, I'm more indifferent towards the results. That doesn't mean that I don't want it to be successful, I don't want it to do well financially, but I'm less dependent on that outcome, and I can accept either.
As you say in your newest work, doing is enough.
Yeah, the effort's got to be enough, because I realized this when I was putting out my last book, is that basically it's you control the effort that you put into the work. You don't control the reception to the work at all, really. And that's a very hard place to come to, but it's ultimately a very freeing one. And, it was funny with Obstacles the Way. That's what I went into thinking. And when it came out, it didn't hit the bestseller list the way that I'd moved enough copies for it to do. Right. And so I had to tell myself, hey, the book is good. That's all that really matters. And so on the one hand, there I am sort of reassuring myself in the face of a disappointment. And then the book went on to do, 10 times better than I ultimately expected. But I had to tell myself the exact same thing. Hey, the book is what it is. You were happy with it. You can't be more happy with it just because it sold well. And so in that way, what Orson Welles is doing, and what I tried to talk about in the book, is that you have to be prepared to write off both catastrophic failure and mind-altering success with the same logic, that what matters is that the book is what it is, or the project is what it is, not what they would call externals, the things that are outside your control.
Let me take a step back. Let's start to break apart your newest work, which is called Ego is the Enemy. Great title. And I think there's three key parts that you've kind of divided the work into: aspiration, success, and failure. I'm going to let you talk a little bit about each as I weave you through this. Really nice in your preface, your opening, and you go into your own life some. I mean, you're not just a guy in this book who's saying, hey, this would be a great title to write about. There's so much interesting information. But it seems like you were inspired. You had to do this work based on your own life.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like all my books come out of my own life. I just prefer not to be in them, because I don't like them resting on me personally if they don't have to, right? I'd rather the research and the facts stand what they are. But I had more of a personal connection to this one, in that, and when I'd sold this book on humility and ego in early 2014, and then in late 2014, I saw, American Apparel collapse. When you watch someone that you respect and admire get thrown out of their own company, and then that company declare bankruptcy not long after it, you sort of go, how does something like this happen, right? And could something like this happen to me? And what am I doing that would contribute to something like that? So that's where my interest in ego sort of was taken to another level. But what I wanted to look at is sort of not, hey, here's some time when I got too big for my britches, or, I got a little delusional. I wanted to look at these things from a historical and a universal perspective. And what I found in the material is that, whether you're aspiring to do something, you're experiencing success or you're experiencing difficulty, ego is pretty much the worst variable you can introduce into any of those equations. It just offers essentially nothing constructive.
Your old boss, it seemed like, in the press accounts, and I remember seeing some of those press accounts and read several of the stories, and I thought of you. I mean, obviously it was not about you, but I knew there was a close association. And it sure seemed like, wow, it seemed like an ego that was on fire, out of control, and perhaps the ego had, consumed him. Yeah,
I think so. I'll tell you sort of what I found, and I think you've probably seen this with a lot of the traders that you have talked to. And actually, there's a line in Billions, which I'd love to know if you like the show or not, but he makes some boneheaded trade where he loses a lot of money, and the therapist is asking him why, and he says, when people tell you you're Superman enough times, you start to think that you are. And I think what happens is so many entrepreneurial ideas are legitimately insane, right? You look at American Apparel, it's like, hey, we're going to be the largest garment manufacturer in the United States. We're going to pay a fair living wage. We're going to make our own clothes. We're going to sell them in our own stores. They're not going to have any branding or logos on them. And t-shirts are going to be, $25. In some ways, that's an insane idea. It's a brilliant idea, but it's also insane. And so when you have an idea like that in any field, and then you make it a reality through your sheer force of will, one can be forgiven for starting to think that they have a superpower. Or when you have to ignore every single critic and doubter on the way to success, that becomes very problematic when you are successful, because now you've acquired a habit of not listening to the people around you. And they might have been wrong before, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong right now. And so I think what you see, and what I've certainly seen in my own experience, is that really successful people get in this position where they've gotten used to just putting aside everyone else's objections or doubts. And what happens when those doubts are correct and are absolutely necessary, and you're just sort of plunging ahead despite all common sense. And that's where the person who built an empire is also the person who destroys their own empire.
Yeah, there's a very famous trader right now. I don't know him, but he's in the press quite a bit. A guy named Bill Ackman. He's involved with this pharmaceuticals company, and they just released some congressional documents the other day. And you start to read this, and you're like, my gosh, this is the guy that supposedly has all the brilliance. He's made billions of dollars for himself, but behind the scenes, he's literally trying to jerry-rig and it looks like make up the fundamentals of the company. And I can't see how that will be good for him in the future.
Yeah, right. I think that's exactly right. In some ways, when you're aspiring to do something, that sheer force of will, if it's not a disadvantage, it can be somewhat adaptive, right? Because your creativity and it's manifesting itself as creativity and persistence and ingenuity. But then what happens is when you're in a position of power, now all of a sudden it sort of you're not the underdog, you're the top dog. And so it can manifest itself as bullying or fraud or criminal activity even. Like, you look at someone like Nixon, he's this brilliant politician who's incredibly ambitious and hungry, but once he gets to the White House, he can't turn that off, right? He can't go, hey, maybe I don't need to win every single fight and I don't need to crush every single enemy. It becomes almost pathological, right? Like, instead of going, okay, now I need to manage my success and I need to secure it, they're just striving for more and more and more, and eventually they put the entire edifice at risk.
I don't want to jump ahead, but you kind of talk about this later in the work, the canvas idea, which is letting other people win. And I think that's so hard. I was thinking about myself today with this podcast, and look, I'm always thinking, okay, I got to dial it back. I got to, But I think what I've tried to do with this podcast, and hopefully it's worked, is to bring someone on like yourself, many other people, and try and find a way to make that other person shine, to let that other person give that really cool insight or insights that they have, and let it come across in a way that maybe they didn't say it before. And that's really my motivation for this podcast. That's what I'd like to do. That's fun to me. Yeah.
I mean, look, it's the same way in books, right? This goes to what you were saying. I'm in this book a little bit, but that was like a big fight for me. And it was only after getting a lot of feedback from other people that sort of made it clear that would be value additive. It's always easier as a writer to talk about yourself because that's what you know the most. It's harder for me. Like, if I have a theory about something, I can tell you about how it happened to me at lunch yesterday, but it's much more work for me to sort of go back through history and find an unassailable example of that, and research it and write it up that way. But ultimately, I find that people relate to that more. And so in some ways, the canvas strategy, it's selfless, but it's also very selfish. Like, if you were on this podcast and you were dominating the conversation, one, I think it's less pleasurable for the listener, but it's also less pleasurable for the guest. And so you sort of realize, oh, hey, if I can take my own ego out of this and focus more on the joint project that we're doing together, then I'm going to be more successful in the long term. And I try to think about that creatively, but also as someone who started out very young, sort of in, I had a number of successful mentors. I'm in the same boat. It's like, hey, my job on the one hand is to learn as much as I can, to get as much as I can out of this. But ultimately, the way I'm going to do that best is if I help these people as much as possible, if I'm sort of seen and not heard. So you have to put your ego aside there. You have to say, hey, look, my job is to do stuff that my boss can take credit for rather than get as much credit as I can myself.
Let me give a few lines that I just love, little things. Ego is stolen, confidence is earned. It's the difference between potent and poisonous. It's poise, not pose. And speaking of great examples, and I know you love to go military, why don't you give a little bit of an insight as to why, and get as specific as you'd like. Why did Mr. Sherman, the great military leader, why did he make this work? What inspired you to include him?
Yeah, so I love William Tecumseh Sherman because I think in many ways he's sort of the antithesis of, say, like a Napoleon. There's the Napoleon-esque general who sort of always who believes that they are destined for greatness and that their life is this journey towards realizing that greatness. Sure, they did great things, but then they also did horrible things and ended their career in sort of disgrace and disaster. And then you compare that to someone like Sherman, who not only didn't believe that, who people not only didn't believe was destined for great things, he himself, I don't think, quite realized how great he could potentially be. And so one of my favorite biographies is B.H. Liddell Hart's biography of Sherman, and there's this passage where that line you just said is actually from. He's saying that, to someone like Sherman, his success in life was a sort of a source of constant surprise. It was this sort of gradual accumulation of skills and acumen and then ultimately success. And that made the accomplishments so much sweeter because he didn't feel, I don't know if you've seen this, but like when you hear these people that have this sort of certainty that they're going to do things, when they actually accomplish that thing, they find that it's disappointing. It's not what they wished it would be. But for Sherman, it was this almost pleasant surprise as he slowly accumulated this greatness. And Liddell Hart says it's poise and not pose. He's not faking it until he makes it. He's just genuinely living in the present moment and facing each sort of battle or opportunity or obstacle as it comes. And I find that as a model to be much more sustainable and much more emulatable as a person. It's, hey, I'm going to take each thing that I'm given and I'm going to do my absolute best here. I'm going to execute brilliantly in each different phase rather than, assuming that the world is crying out to hear my name. And so when you see someone like Sherman, who's probably America's greatest strategic general, I would argue that he was. You can maybe argue there's a couple people up there right there with him. He did this despite everyone's expectations, and I find that so much more impressive than say a General McClellan, who was the sort of the mind marked for great things in the U.S. Civil War, but was probably in practice one of our worst generals, and later became almost sort of like a Donald Trump-esque figure. I just found him to be very fascinating and very inspiring. It's more relatable, I think, as well.
One of the things you just mentioned that I think is so important, the idea of iteration, the step at a time. And this is not something that I think the vast majority of people that want to achieve, somebody's listening right now and they want to achieve whatever they want to achieve in their life. But too many people don't understand that it's the baby step, build on top. You don't necessarily know where everyone's going to go, but you just have to keep stepping every damn day. And if you don't do that, and I would love for you to comment on this too, ultimately it seems like the vast majority of people are lost in this social media cacophony of like, look at me, I'm going to do something. But actually, you're not really doing anything if you're telling someone you're doing it all day long.
Totally, yeah. Like one of my favorite books is this book. It's called Working on My Novel. and it's just tweets of people talking about how they're working on their novel. And obviously they're not working on their novel, or they wouldn't have sent this tweet, right? And I think the flip side of what you're talking about is what Nassim Taleb calls the narrative fallacy. People not only don't see it as one step at a time, they see it, so some people see it as chaos, other people see it as this grand story that they're living. And so they look retroactively, they look both forward and backwards, and they're telling themselves this story instead of facing each thing as it comes and understanding that, hey, it's going to go somewhere, but I'm not quite sure where. I think I'm working on this piece now. It's like we sort of tell ourselves these stories about how we planned this from day one, when in reality it was a series of consecutive decisions that happened to culminate in some event. But it is not, Google didn't set out to change the world. It's like these two guys are finishing their grad thesis. That's what they're doing. And it happened to turn into a company because they were able to spot an opportunity inside this project that they were working on. But it would be preposterous to retroactively give Larry and Sergey credit for creating Alphabet, right? Like 5 years ago, they had no idea it was going to become a holding company called Alphabet. And 50 years ago, Warren Buffett had no idea he was going to be the world's richest man. But it was really about focusing on the individual decisions as they happened and doing them right that can ultimately create that. But it's not. I'm less convinced that one needs this grand, sweeping, bold vision for the future.
Well, yes, if we look back in time, and I don't say this in any kind of a negative way, just kind of a factual way. I mean, Google's success is based off tiny little ads. I think back to the infomercial in the mid-1990s for this guy, Don Lapre, who was selling tiny little ads to people. The vast majority of Google's money came from that. They used the money to do a lot of cool things, but that was the factual start.
Yeah, right. It's a very practical nuts and bolts business that since they and so the problem with telling the story is not just that it's not honest, it's that you start to get consumed with the sweeping, sexy, fancy parts of things, and then you can ignore, you can go, hey, self-driving cars, that's going to be a multi-billion-dollar business, or Google Glass, it's going to be the future. And it's like, hey, remember when you guys made hundreds of billions of dollars with this, tiny, crappy ad software? And so you end up missing the things that are actually similar to what you've been successful with in the past because you're focused on these pie in the sky ideas that seem fun and interesting, but, historically have not been the creators of enormous wealth.
I love this great line. I want to read this from your book. It's really brief. Pride and ego say, I'm an entrepreneur because I struck out on my own. I'm going to win because I'm currently in the lead. I'm a writer because I published something. I'm rich because I made some money. I'm special because I was chosen. I am important because I think I should be.
Yeah, we love labels, right? Like the amount of people that I have told me, because I'll get introduced at parties and someone will be like, oh, this is Ryan, he's a writer. And someone will be like, oh, I'm a writer too. And I'll be like, oh, what have you written? And then it's like nothing, And I don't mean to say that like I'm a writer and they're not, but it's just interesting how people give themselves these labels as, I think in some ways, to compensate for the fact that the work isn't there. Like, I feel really, I've gotten to a point now where I guess I'm comfortable with someone calling me a writer, but like sometimes someone will introduce me and they'll be like, oh, Ryan's also an entrepreneur. And I'll be like, just because I have a business doesn't mean that I'm an entrepreneur. I think I think for the most part, that label is only giving me credit for something that isn't helpful to me. Do you know what I mean? It's making me feel that it's implying that I'm better or more accomplished in something than I really am. And so I think generally you try to avoid those things because they're not constructive to doing the work that you're trying to do.
Those things all attach to ego.
Totally, because we want the reason we're doing the thing, the reason we're starting a business or we're writing a book or we want to be called a writer or whatever is because we want whatever social status is associated with that. But if you get the status before you've done the work, in some ways now all of a sudden you have less motivation to do the work. And the work sucks sometimes. And you have to have a motivation for getting through that sucky part.
I think you planned it a little bit more on the writing than I did, but I was listening to Wells today and him talking, and the interviewer asking him about the various camera angles and whatnot. And he's like, look, we were ignorant. We didn't know. We didn't know we couldn't do that. I love that feeling. I love that feeling of not knowing what, just do it.
Yeah, or I was watching Mark Maron's TV show a while ago, and some person was like, ooh, what made you decide to become a writer? And he was just like, a book deal. And I think that's a much, more humble, productive answer than like, oh, I have these things inside me that I'm trying to get out. I think we can imbue the things that we're doing with a sort of self-importance and pomposity that makes the craft of the actual thing much more difficult.
One of your chapters, you were talking about becoming a student. And I thought this was great. I thought your example, a heavy metal example, was great. I had some familiarity with all of the names that you mentioned. In fact, I would be the guy that would say, I had a friend of mine that used to tell me how great Satriani was as a guitarist, but I couldn't stand his music. And I really never liked Metallica, but I did like Dave Mustaine's stuff once he left Metallica. So, but anyways, why don't you retell that story? Because obviously Satriani and Kirk Hammett, Metallica, these guys were top of the heap. But why don't you relay that story and why you thought it was so important to put in ego as the enemy?
Yeah, I was just always fascinated by the fact that Kirk Hammett, who's one of the best heavy metal guitarists of all time, was a student of Joe Satriani, who's one of the best sort of guitar virtuosos of all time. And I remember seeing that in a Behind the Music or something at some point, and I always thought it was really interesting. And when I was writing this book, and I wanted to tell a story of a really talented person who sort of continued their education anyway, I looked into that, and what I was so interested to find that, Kirk Hammett it wasn't like he was 17 years old and he sought out this guitar teacher and then they both went on to be famous. It's that Kirk Hammett was selected to be in Metallica. Dave Mustaine, who went on to found Megadeth, was the original guitarist of Metallica. He got kicked out. Kirk Hammett is chosen to be in this band that's clearly going places, that's already doing pretty well. And then he hires a guitar teacher. And the idea that it's like when you find out that Tiger Woods is a golf coach and you're like, whoa. Here I am thinking I'm good enough at what I do, and one of the best people in the world is seeking out a teacher. And so I love this idea of hey, I'm not good enough yet. I need to find someone who can help make me better. And you see that in Hammett seeking out Satriani, and they both did go on to do bigger and better things, but it was this student mindset that like, hey, I'm never good enough. I have to keep learning. I think is inherently a suppressant on ego. You think about it, it's like you're chosen to be in this amazing band, and then you attach yourself to a teacher who's so much better than you. That's inherently humbling, and it's inherently antagonistic to the ego, because you can't sit at the knee of someone who is so much better and still, and have delusions about yourself. And so I think that's what Hammett got out of working with Satriani. And I've tried to, I've done that in my own life. I'm always trying to seek out writers who are better than me, clients who are better than me. I'm trying to surround myself with people that I can learn from.
I think that's part of the reason I keep doing the podcast is how else does one get the chance to just talk to so many interesting people that have spent their life. And that's what's so cool too, is people. I love talking to people that have dedicated their life to a niche. I mean, yes, we all want to be the polymath. We all want to have all this wide insights and whatnot. But the niche person, they just bring it. I love it.
Yeah. And then what I thought was so fascinating about the Metallica story is that Dave Mustaine, who's kicked out, goes on to create Megadeth, and Megadeth is one of my favorite bands. I think they're amazing. But if you haven't watched Some Kind of Monster, which I think is one of the best documentaries ever made, here he is 20 years later, and he's still bitter and pissed off that he got kicked out of this band when he was like 20 years old. When you watch this, and he's laying out the case for how they screwed him over, and they definitely screwed him over, and he's so angry about it. Like, you could be, if you didn't know who he was, you could be mistaken for thinking that he was living under a bridge somewhere. But really, it's like he'd started his own band. He'd sold millions of records. He was rich. He was famous. He was all these things. But because he held on to this grudge, in the way that Orson Welles didn't, it nearly ruined his life. I mean, it nearly killed him. And it's not just, hey, how can we, stay humble so we can learn, but also how can we make sure that ego doesn't eat away at us and undermine the success that we do find.
Well, Dave's a great example too, and I think we could go further. One of the more popular, famous names would be Steve Jobs. These people that have had great egos and great success. So, somebody listening might say, hey, Mr. Holliday, what about these guys that have had fantastic egomaniac lives and they just, there's no control of the ego, but they still have massive success. You point out, though, you say, hey, hold on, let's analyze this a little bit deeper, and let's talk about the concept of outliers.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's a couple of things that these outliers prove to you. One, I'm not going to shy away from the fact that there are plenty of successful egotistical people, but as you know, correlation and causation are not the same thing. But when you look at someone like Steve Jobs, first off, I would say there's no dancing around the fact that he deserved to be fired from Apple. He was fucking awful, right? Like, he was unmanageable. He was unaccountable. He was crazy. He wasn't producing the results that he needed to produce. And so the board was forced to fire him, and they did fire him. The fact that retroactively he came back later and was successful does not mitigate or change the circumstances with which that original decision was made. And I think what's important to think about with Steve Jobs is the fact that he came back, that was not guaranteed either. What if he'd not done the personal work required? What if that could have very easily been the end of the Steve Jobs story, and the world would have turned out very differently. So I think all of that, needs to be, it doesn't get its due. And then what also doesn't get its due is the fact that Steve Jobs remade his life post Apple. He started 2 other companies, one of which was Pixar. He clearly learned a lot. He didn't learn everything. He didn't improve every flaw in his personality, but he did address the most egregious parts of his personality. And so when he came back to Apple, ultimately, he was changed, not fundamentally, but enough that he wasn't his own worst enemy anymore. He wasn't a liability. He was the strengths far outweighed the weaknesses. And that's what allowed him to create the world's most valuable company, although it just got knocked down a little bit. But that couldn't, the Steve Jobs that was fired originally was not the Steve Jobs that invented the iPod and the iPhone and the tablet. Those are different people. And in many ways, the one became the other because he was fired and had to face some of those harsh truths.
We're all interlopers. Whenever we're looking at somebody else's life, we can never truly imagine the multiple acts in their life. And when you're living, I think of myself, yourself, when you're living the experience, it's always different than the observer. The observer only sees bits and pieces. Yeah. And look, I just tried to put myself in John Scully's shoes. I would have fired Steve Jobs. Like, if you've ever been in an office that had a toxic, egomaniac in it, you do what you can because they're so talented. You try to work with them, and you try to make exceptions, and you hold them to a different standard. And it seems like, from what I've read, he did literally everything he possibly could. And they were all crying when they fired him. It was not like a decision they took lightly, but they had to force their hand. And in many ways, we're lucky that he did that, because it forced him to face that truth about himself, which he addressed in some way. But again, that could have been the end of the story. That could have been, hey, remember, he could have been the cautionary tale that all CEOs are now told about, instead of the inspiring example that he ultimately became. So if I move away from Jobs and I kind of get back to the idea of this iterative work, I think many people, because of things like the 10,000 hour rule, many people have started to understand, okay, I need to buckle down. I got to put a lot of time in. And you addressed this a little bit in your work. And I kind of texted you about this a couple of weeks ago, too, because I had a guy on my podcast who had done this original work, Anders Ericsson. And Gladwell kind of got this wrong. There is really no such thing as a 10,000 hour rule. And I think when people see this newest work of yours, Ego is the Enemy, they're going to realize that you're writing this book in the context of a bell curve and knowing about outliers. And so anyone that thinks, okay, yes, maybe Steve Jobs didn't go the right direction, things worked out for him. But on the flip side, if you just say to yourself, well, if I do 10,000 hours, that will be gold. That's all I need to do is 10,000 hours and it will all work out for me. That's not accurate either.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because Robert Greene in Mastery, he says it's more like 20,000 hours. And so I've seen people go like, is it 10,000 or 20,000? And it's like, it's not a number. It's just a lot, you know, there's not like, you don't get an award when you get your 10,000th hour. It's somewhere on a continuum. And that's a pretty good estimate that the academics have come up with, you know, and it's extrapolated out from some pretty narrow examples like chess and violin and some other stuff.
The goal is not 10,000 hours. The goal is the process you're going through to achieve some level of expertise or the achievement you're chasing. But I think sometimes these numbers are getting turned into the actual goal.
Yeah, totally. It might be 30,000 hours for you, or it might be 5,000 hours, you know, really deliberate. Who knows? But the answer is that it's a lot. And the answer is, if you think it's a specific number, you're missing the point. You know, like, it's the process that matters, the dedication to the craft. Again, you know, for what a lot of us do, there is no end point, right? So it's like, you take writing as an example, right? Let's say it takes 10,000 hours to be a master at this craft. That doesn't mean that that's the point at which you start making money from doing it. Perhaps you make money on your 100th hour, or perhaps you don't. You're a novelist, and it's not until 30 years in that your amazing work is finally discovered. So there's a lot of variables that matter a great deal that get lost in this simplification. And I think there's a certain amount of ego and entitlement in thinking, oh, okay, give me the number, I'm going to do the number, and then I want you to give me what I've earned when I get to that number.
I thought you had a great example with the ex-football coach, Bill Walsh of the 49ers. And I think there's just some great lines that I've written down here. You know, success or whatever it might be, it can't happen if you're convinced the world revolves around you. I mean, that's such a simple, but we're talking ego today. But why don't you talk about Bill Walsh's early success? Because a lot of people could look back in history and they could say, well, you know, everything was planned. He was so meticulous. He was so detailed. But there's always variability. There's always randomness. I can think back to the first touchdown, well, not the first touchdown, but the touchdown pass from Montana to Dwight Clark, this very famous catch. I mean, that's a fingertip thing. I mean, it didn't have to go that way, but then we create the legend after the fact, but it's not necessarily, that's not the outcome is one thing. Again, back to what the whole concept, the whole idea of this work, the process is something else.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's so interesting about Walsh is when he took over the 49ers, he had sort of unprecedented control of the franchise. But one of the other he was sort of he was focused on what he called the standards of performance, where these seemingly insignificant details, like coaches had to wear a tie, you know, picture frames in the locker room could not be crooked, and you couldn't sit down on the practice field, and a lot of people resented this sort of micromanagement. And one of the coaches complained to the owner that Walsh didn't have a timetable for winning, and Walsh fired him because he didn't have a timetable for winning. And that this coach thought that was important, was missing the entire point of how he wanted to turn the franchise around. I think what I took from Walsh's book, he has an amazing book called The Score Takes Care of Itself. He has this thing, he's like, look, what a team does, the way one wins a football championship is that all the good teams are essentially even at a certain level. And somebody goes on a run towards the end of the season, and that run ends in a Super Bowl victory. And so what he thought is, I want to make a base camp near the summit so then we could be in a position to make that run if the conditions align. That's his attitude towards success. It's not, hey, we're winning the Super Bowl this year. It's, hey, we're going to work really hard to be in a position to win the Super Bowl. And if the calls go our way, if the schedule goes our way, if injuries break our way, etc., this might be our year. And it just happened. He was humble enough to admit that it actually happened earlier than he thought it would happen. It happened in 2 years instead of 7 years, the way it might for other coaches.
I think one of the things that you touch on that I really love too is that Howard Hughes. It's there's been the romance of Howard Hughes, but when you get under the covers, you've got really an entitled weirdo who really didn't have much business success. He had a lot of freaking money, but I mean, you know what? I don't know what the hell we're supposed to learn. I mean, I've met plenty of super rich people in my life, and some of them you meet and you immediately go, wow, that person is inspiring. I can feel their intelligence. I can feel their hard work. And you meet other people that are freaking loaded and you just say, my God, they got lucky.
Yeah, totally. And look, I think Howard Hughes is I mean, you study this a lot, and what you do is the survivorship bias warps our perspective in such an incredible degree, right? We only hear about successful people because you can't hear about most unsuccessful people because they're not notable. What's so interesting about Howard Hughes is that because he inherited this company from his father, which had a near monopoly on the bits required for oil drilling, he was essentially able to fail like a couple dozen times. It's not like even a Donald Trump who has like both a mix of success and failure. Howard Hughes was, I think you could say, like one of the worst businessmen of the 20th century in the sense that everything he was directly involved with failed, and the things that he handed off to advisors to run because he was bored or distracted were successful. And so in many ways, the fact that these other people were so successful was what allowed him to descend into this insanity and to be so perpetually unsuccessful. I mean, like, even the things that he was successful with, like, for instance, he made a lot of money in Las Vegas real estate, for instance. Can you really give credit to someone for spotting how valuable real estate in Las Vegas would be when they bought a hotel because they didn't want to move out of the penthouse suite and the hotel was trying to evict them, right? It's like, no, it's that an insane clock is right occasionally, and when you look at Howard Hughes, you not only see this miserable person who died a horrible death, basically a self-inflicted, sort of decade-long suicide almost, most accurately, but you see someone who he made one of his most successful business deals was TWA, which he was only forced to realize because investors kicked him out of the company via a number of shareholder lawsuits that required him to sell his stock. It's like, given a long enough timeline, he almost certainly would have run that company into the ground too. And so, you see, we love mavericks, but we forget that mavericks are more the exception that prove the rule. And more often than not, you wouldn't trade places with them if you are actually given the opportunity.
Speaking of Hughes, and speaking of, I'm not comparing the guy that I'm about to mention, but paranoia. And just recently, Andy Grove of Intel passed away. Generally, very highly respected individual of high achievement, but he has this one great expression, only the paranoid survive. And I know you talk about paranoia a little in your work. How do you feel when you hear that from Andy Grove?
I mean, look, I think the idea of the Stoics were very big on negative visualization, sort of thinking of the worst case scenario, so you're aware of it and you're prepared for it. I think if you're using a line like that to just be vigilant, you're great. But there's another Stoic quote from Seneca where he's saying, I think it's like, fake fears generate real fears, right? And he's saying generally the things that we're paranoid about become a self-fulfilling prophecy where, hey, I'm scared that these employees are going to screw me over, so I'm not going to trust them, and then they're not going to be bought in, and then they actually are going to try to screw me over, and then I'm going to tell myself that I was right, when in reality I made myself right with my own stupidity and short-sightedness. And so I think paranoia, if if we're using paranoia as a synonym for vigilance, okay. But if we're actually using paranoia, which is, you're seeing a monster, behind every door and a tiger inside every bush, you're probably going to do far more damage than if there actually was, a tiger in the brush.
We talked about it early on, and so far I've led you through we're talking aspiration, we're talking success, but a big piece of this newest work of yours is failure. And I brought it up earlier that doing is enough, but because many people don't get this, that you could do everything right, everything, and you can still fail. You can still fail. I mean, Jim Rogers wrote this book, Investment Biker. He's got this great quote about look, you could spend 20 years going down this path. You might become, the next Kirov ballerina, travel around the world on a motorcycle. But guess what? One wrong mistake and you could blow it all and you got nothing to show for it.
Yeah, or the effort is enough, right? I could write this book and I could do all the marketing, and then a hurricane could happen the day it comes out and all my media gets wiped away and no one's interested in reading a book, right? That can happen.
Dealing with that, though, thinking about that possibility and then being able to deal with it, that's the crux of it.
Yeah, right. Easier said than done, obviously. And I think the other part of it is okay, what am I going to let that failure say about me as a person? Hopefully nothing, right? That. I think that's the other thing. So if you're in a position where succeeding makes you feel good about yourself and gives you your confidence, then what's going to be problematic is that when you fail, you're gonna tell yourself it says the same things about you as a person. Like they say, if you read the good reviews and listen to them, then you got to take the bad reviews the same way. Ideally, you should take none of the reviews, right? You should focus on your own judgment of success. You should focus on your own internal metrics. Warren Buffett talks about this, having an internal scorecard, not just an external scorecard. Just because an investment turns out to be right doesn't mean that it was a good investment. What if you made it out of ego, or you made it out of ignorance, or you made it out of laziness? If you let the external factor, if you let the fact that it was ultimately vindicated by the market vindicate the subpar decisions that went into it, now all of a sudden you've just established a very bad habit.
One of the things that I love about this, what you've put together, is that, and we mentioned at the very beginning of the conversation, it's not necessarily only for, or it's not necessarily geared to the brand new beginner in business, life, whatnot, that doesn't have a lot of experience. So if you do have some experience and you do have some scars, when you see things like a Fight Club moment, that really punches someone like me right in the gut, because it's like, wow, you really need to have a great life of achievement and to keep pressing and keeping on that iterative track. These Fight Club moments, I mean, man, you got, if they're not just randomly happening, you have to go find them.
Yeah, or I mean, look at all the people that sort of got caught when the tide went out during the financial crisis. Like, you could say, hey, that was unfair, that was crappy, or that shouldn't have happened. Or you can say, hey, this was a reminder to me. This was a learning experience. This was proof to me of why these things matter. I think we all need, if it were possible to learn everything by books, that would be great. But the reality is some lessons can only be taught by very painful experience. And oftentimes those are the things that we want to hear the least, but we need to hear the most.
But you also have this great quote from Bismarck. In effect, any fool can learn from experience. The trick is to learn from other people's experience. It's a balance.
It's totally a balance. Yeah. Ideally, you want your failures to be painful, but not fatal or not near fatal.
Talk about also this feeling. And if you want to relay a little bit about your experience, that'd be great. But, to go through aspiration, success, failure, to get to the other side of that mountain and then say, okay, I might have to start over. But that feeling of going through that process, those, the aspiration, success, failure, and then coming out on the other side and then kicking it into gear again, that feeling is really a magnificent feeling.
Yeah, well, I think I see it as each person is at one of those phases at any given point in their life, and it's a constant process. So, you're young, you're aspiring to do something, and you fail. And then you've got to decide, okay, am I going to try again, or am I going to stay here? Or you're aspiring to something and you succeed. You either aspire to something greater on top of that, or you mess it up and now you're dealing with difficulty and adversity again. So we're constantly there, and I've been in all those phases myself, and I'll be in all those phases again with each thing that we do. We're you sit down and start a project. Okay, you have a goal for it. You're either going to be successful or it's going to turn out to be much more complicated and harder than you thought. You're always there. Not only is it that you're always there, but whenever you are there, the worst thing that you can introduce there would be your ego, your delusions, your entitlements. The idea that whatever this is says something about you as a person. That's just the worst variable for each in all of those phases.
You're kind of an old guy in a young guy's body. You know this, right?
I feel very old, yeah.
Yeah, you're not like... the stuff that you read, the stuff that you're into. So I'm curious, your perspective, though, as I look at this work, the demographics. And if look, the millennial generation is catching a lot of heat these days. Basically... as far as I can tell from major media, it's just kind of tuned out, not interested, or I'm not even sure how to describe. But have you thought about how your work presents, this particular work, would present to different age groups in the year 2016? And would those groups take it differently? For example, is social media obscuring a younger generation to even being able to accept some of the things you're saying? I still feel like I got one foot in the grave because I know what pre-internet felt like. So I know what post-internet feels like. But do you think there's some of the messaging that you're giving that some younger people, look, the messaging of their world is like, why do I want to listen to Sky Holiday? All this stuff is like old guy stuff.
Yeah, that is something I thought a lot about. I started... The first third of the book, I think, is mostly directed towards someone who hasn't accomplished something. I think people who have accomplished something can relate to it and will appreciate the fundamentals. But yeah, my generation, grew up with social media, and so the idea of telling everyone what you're going to do and getting congratulated for it in advance is endemic to my generation. I think it's prevented a lot of people from actually doing the things that they've set out to do. I did direct a large part of this to people my age, but I think at the end of the day, every generation goes through these growing pains. Not every generation graduates into a massive financial recession, which I think has had some knockdown effects. But my goal with my books is that wherever you are, you find some value. You find some value in what I'm talking about, and I want a young person to be like, oh, this is exactly what I needed to hear. Thank you. And then I take a lot out of hearing older, successful people telling who have been through even more than what I've been through, telling me that, hey, this stands up. You got it right. Because I'm writing both for a younger version of myself, and then I think writing for what I'm going through or feel like I'm facing next. So I'm writing for myself who like you sort of has a foot in both camps.
The book, Ego is the Enemy, Ryan Holiday. Ryan, where can people go to find out about you? And one final question, no subtitle. This really talks about the power that you have in the publishing industry now, because how did you talk your way out of that? They all want to give you a subtitle.
Well, thank you for noticing. No one's noticed yet. I just felt like there wasn't a subtitle that said more than the title, and my publisher thankfully agreed with me. But I feel like Robert Greene gave me that advice at some point. He said, ideally you just want the book to be the book. No one remembers the subtitle anyway. So that's what it is. My website's ryanholiday.net, and I'm at Ryan Holiday on Twitter.
Book availability?
Everywhere. It's out in the UK a month after in the US, but it's out everywhere in the US on June 14th.
Ryan, keep writing. I always have fun reading your stuff.
Thanks, man. We'll talk soon.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.